Hello, welcome to another edition of Only in Illinois, your weekly recap from Reboot Illinois. I'm Madeline Dubeck here with Matt Dietrich. And this week and in the last few weeks, Governor Bruce Rauner and the Republican legislators and legislative leaders have been going around the state hopscotching from one place to another, calling for a revamp of the entire way the legislature is chosen. They keep talking about two things, one being a fairer way to draw political maps, but the other one that we want to focus on today is they're really pushing term limits.
Right. Term limits has become the new cause. It was a big part of Bruce Rauner's campaign in the 2014 election, getting term limits, and he put a lot of money and a lot of effort into a citizen-led initiative in 2014 to gather signatures to get that on the ballot. And that's quite a feat because he needed, somewhere in the neighborhood of 300,000 registered voter signatures to do that. They did that successfully, and then it went all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court ruled for the second time in 20 years, ruled that term limits are outside of the bounds of what a citizen-led initiative can put on to the ballot to change the state constitution. We've said this before, but the state constitution only allows citizen-led initiatives to change the structure and function of the Illinois General Assembly. And since our Constitution's been in place in 1970, only once has a citizen-led initiative ever become law, and that was in 1980, and it was when Pat Quinn led what came to be known as the Cutback Amendment. There used to be 177 members of the Illinois House, and the Cutback Amendment was Quinn's payback for lawmakers voting themselves a pay raise. It cut the size of the House by 1/3. So now you have 118 members of the House, and the entire General Assembly has 177 members. But that's the only citizen-led initiative that's ever gotten onto the ballot and become law.
So this time, the governor and Republicans are saying we don't want a citizen-led initiative, but we want you, the people, to pressure your lawmakers into voting to put this on the ballot themselves, because that's a much more direct route.
Right, because twice now the state Supreme Court has said we're not going to, you cannot put term limits on the ballot. They did it in 1994 again by a Pat Quinn-led effort. That almost got on the ballot, didn't. And then, of course, in 2014, you had Rauner's effort, and they said it again. So now Governor Rauner and the Republicans are taking a different tack because the General Assembly can propose changing the Constitution any way they want to. And what it takes is you have to have a 3/5 majority in the House and a 3/5 majority in the Senate to vote to put a constitutional amendment on the general election ballot for people to vote on. They can do it for anything. Citizens can only do it for the structure and function of the General Assembly. So what Rauner and the Republicans are trying to push now is they want people to pressure the Democrats, who control 3/5 of the General Assembly, to put this on the 2018 election ballot, because they've got the power to do that.
Wait a second.
Can't be on the
2018?
It's too late to be on the 2016.
But they're going around the state making it sound like this is about to happen.
This is one of the things there's a lot of confusion about this, and because we're in an election season, and also because you have this redistricting amendment that is before the Supreme Court now, that may or may not end up on the ballot. But that's different. Now, what Rauner is talking about is he wants the majority Democrats to allow a vote on a constitutional amendment to impose term limits, probably 8 years, on constitutional officers and senators and representatives. And this is politically, it really is super highly unlikely. What Rauner,
so he's asking that they take a vote in November after the election.
After the election.
After the election.
Right.
in the fall veto session to put this on a ballot, but the first ballot that it could go on would be in 2018.
Right.
In November.
It has to be on a general election, and those are in the even year November elections.
So then it wouldn't really take effect until January of 2019.
Right.
And that would only mean that that's when the new clock, if it were approved, starts ticking on those 8 years.
And it would depend on how they write it. Who knows how long the term limits would be, how it would work, would everybody who's there now be grandfathered in and get a whole brand new as soon as the law goes into effect? All that kind of stuff. All
that has to be worked out. But just to give people an idea, because this is what stop to think about when you hear these press conferences or these stories. 2019, another 8 years gets tacked on.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking 2027.
Right.
House Speaker Michael Madigan is how old?
I think he's 74.
And right now in 2016, and you add in to 27, so that's 21 more years.
something like that.
So he'd be 95 when he would be term limited out?
Depends on how it worked, how the details
For
work.
example?
It depends on how the details work, but I think your bigger point is there's really one reason, one person why there's this drive for term limits, and that's House Speaker Michael Madigan. He's been in the General Assembly as a representative since 1971. He has been House Speaker for all but 2 years since 1983. And it's not just that he's got this longevity, it's also that Mike Madigan has done his job so well for his caucus that he really has controlled how things work in the General Assembly, and the Republicans really, really resent that. And there's no other way to say it. That's it. I think, for one, I'm not a big supporter of term limits because I don't think there's any proof that they bring better government. Mm-hmm. I'm also not big on any kind of a bill that is aimed at one person or one changing one thing, but it has to paint with a very broad brush, which is what this is. And I also think when you do this, what you do is you get people who, just when they're starting to learn how to be a legislator, and it's not a simple job.
Takes 40 years to learn how to be a
maybe not 40 years, but probably more than 8.
Yeah.
Then they're term limited out. The people who really gain power by this are the bureaucrats behind the scenes who do a lot of the nuts and bolts work. I also think that imposing term limits at the state level, we already have a pretty fast spinning revolving door between the legislature and the lobbying industry. And you put an 8-year term limit on that, and you'll have people coming in and right away they're starting to work on their lobbying career because they know, hey, I only got 4 terms here or a couple of Senate terms.
Some of them do that now already.
And that is exactly right. Some of them do that now already. So, I just think overall that we have the power now to vote people out.
But to your larger point, this is aimed directly at House Speaker Madigan and the power he holds. And the power he holds is to decide which bills come to the floor for a vote and which ones don't. So the chances of term limits actually being put on a ballot by a Democratic supermajority legislature controlled by Mike Madigan are what?
Are about -3.
Okay, that's
something like in that order. And it's in the Senate as well. You have, John Cullerton has been in the Senate since 1991.
But he was in the House before
He was in the House since 1979. But there's another issue here, and that is, in addition to Governor Rauner, he's got Republicans going around the state, and they've held their own press conferences elsewhere to push this. But, Jim Durkin, who is the leader of the House Republicans, he's been in office since January of 2006. He was also, before then, he served for 8 years from 95 to 03. Then he ran against Dick Durbin and he was out for a few years, but he's coming up on,
he's 18 years in.
Well, he's 10 years in his second continuous run.
Total 18.
And Christine Radogno,
Yes.
in
She's
January.
the Senate Republican leader.
She's the Senate Republican leader, and in January, she will have been in office for 20 years. So it's not as if this is something that's been widely practiced. And even, you can go back to the mid-90s when you had Newt Gingrich and the Contract with America, and you had a whole crop of Republicans who came into office then promising that I'm only going to serve X number of terms. I think it was, 8 years for them?
Yeah.
And John Shimkus was one of them. And then when his time came, well, he reconsidered. And he is still he's still in Congress representing the Southwestern District in Illinois. So I'm just not a big believer in term limits in general. I can see where people are disgusted enough, and I wouldn't complain if they were imposed in Illinois the way our government has gone. I don't think you're going to get the results that you expect from them, but the bigger point is, I don't think it's going to happen. It's not going to get called for a vote.
It's not going to happen anytime soon, and even if it were to be called for a vote, I mean, heck, Mike Madigan might call it for a vote and send it to resounding defeat in November. But even if it were to pass and get a vote and pass, it would be another 3 years before the clock would actually start ticking.
Right.
Almost.
Right. And Madigan, of course, he
So
won't say it directly, but he won't call it for a vote because anybody who votes against term limits now is really going to incur the wrath of the electorate.
So, and that to my next point, which was, so why is Governor Rauner pushing so hard for this right now?
This is the
Because
message.
it's politically popular with voters.
It sure is, and we do have an election coming up, and this gives Rauner and the Republicans another chance to say that Madigan and the Democrats that he leads, who control 3/5 of the General Assembly, will not do the will of the people. And Rauner can bring up the fact that he did run this citizen initiative 2 years ago, and he had hundreds of thousands of signatures that were valid on it.
Right.
Didn't get onto the ballot. But what he's saying now is, hey, 2 years ago, the people said they wanted this. Why won't you give it to them? And he's also bringing up the redistricting reform issue, which now is before the Supreme Court. That could end up on the ballot. We don't know yet. But all of these things, both of them could very easily get onto the ballot if the General Assembly would put them on, because they don't have the high hurdle that ordinary citizens have to jump before they can get anything done on their own.
All right, and the Senate and House, we should just add quickly, did both vote on different ways to draw maps this spring.
They did a nice cover. They covered themselves well.
Exactly.
The House and Speaker Madigan voted for it. They voted for their own.
Two different versions.
Never
they
made
both
it to the
have
Senate.
to vote on the same version.
The Senate
and so
voted
it never
on their
went
own.
to the governor.
Right. So everybody can say, hey, we voted for redistricting reform, but it was the House and the Senate's separate versions. Nothing came out, so it's up to the people if they want fair maps.
Right. So unfortunately, those are the games our politicians play. That's it for this week's edition. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next edition of Only in Illinois.